I'm Camille Charles. I'm director of the Center for Africana Studies and professor of sociology, Africana Studies, and education here at the university. And I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for coming and ask that as we begin, you please silence your cell phones and other electronic devices. The Center for Africana Studies, along with Penn Law, welcomes you to the Honorable A. Leon Higginbotham Jr. Memorial Lecture featuring Maya Wiley. The Honorable A. Leon Higginbotham Jr. Memorial Lecture honors Judge Higginbotham's contributions to the American legal and scholarly communities and to the University of Pennsylvania. Presented during the fall semester each year, the lecture focuses on a topic, event, or personality in the African American community of either historical or contemporary significance in the areas of history, law, sociology, or social justice. The lecture was renamed in 1999 after Judge Higginbotham's death in 1998. We want to thank our co-host, Penn Law, and Dean Ruger for his partnership and generous support for this annual lecture. Truly, this program would not be possible without his and the law school's support. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dorothy Roberts, professor of law and sociology and Africana studies. She will provide a brief tribute to the Honorable A. Leon Higginbotham Jr. and introduce our guest this evening, Maya Wiley. Please join me in welcoming Dorothy Roberts.
Thank you, Dr. Charles, for that introduction and welcoming our audience. I love this lecture because it combines my affiliations in law and Africana studies. So it's one of my favorites for that reason and more. And I'd like to take some time to highlight some of the many accomplishments and contributions that Judge Higginbotham made to the law and to social justice in our society, and it is in his memory that this annual lecture is named. Judge Higginbotham began his legal career as a law clerk to Justice Curtis Bach of the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas here in Pennsylvania, and in 1953 he was appointed as an assistant district attorney in Philadelphia. In 1954, he became a founding partner of the first African-American firm in Philadelphia, Norris, Schmidt, Green, Harris, and Higginbotham. In 1962, President Kennedy appointed him to the Federal Trade Commission, making him the youngest person to serve on a federal regulatory commission. In 1963, President Kennedy nominated Higginbotham to the Eastern District Court of Pennsylvania, and in January 1964, Higginbotham received a recess appointment from President Lyndon Johnson and was confirmed in March, making him one of the youngest judges ever appointed to the federal bench. I would imagine one of the few African-American judges as well. He played an important role in the civil rights movement as an advisor to President Johnson after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and served as vice chairman of the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence under President Johnson. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter appointed him to the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, where he remained for 16 years, serving as chief judge from 1989 until 1991, and as senior judge until his retirement in 1993. During his more than 30-year relationship to the University of Pennsylvania, Judge Higginbotham was a member of the Board of Overseers for the law school, chairman of the Board of Overseers of the law school and the Graduate School of Education, adjunct professor in the law school, and a university trustee from 1968 until his death in 1998. In recognition of and appreciation for his, quote, generous service to others, his judicious compassion, the Board of Trustees conferred upon Judge Higginbotham the honorary degree of Doctor of Laws in May 1975. And I just want to add to this bio that Judge Higginbotham was also a great legal scholar. He wrote a book called In the Matter of Color, Race and the American Legal Process, which included a first volume on the colonial period, which was published in 1980. And I know personally, when I was working on my book, Killing the Black Body, and looking for evidence of the regulation of enslaved women's reproduction and childbearing during the slavery era, I found his book to be really the only resource that had those laws, those colonial laws. And I just mentioned one of them. I know I'm going off script, sorry. I'll get to you very soon, our honored guest. But that's where I discovered the first law that was ever passed in the colonies in 1662 in Virginia that decided that the status of a woman, of a child born to a Black woman and fathered by a white man would have the status of the mother. That's where I discovered that in his work. So this is a great tribute to a great scholar and judge and public servant, Alien Higginbotham. And now I want to turn to our wonderful speaker for tonight. We were just saying prior to this start of the event how timely, given the election, midterm elections last night, and everything else that's going on politically in America, that we should have Maya Wiley as our Higginbotham lecturer this year. Maya Wiley is a nationally renowned expert on racial justice and equity. She has litigated, lobbied the U.S. Congress, and developed programs to transform structural racism in the United States and in South Africa. Ms. Wiley is currently the Senior Vice President for Social Justice at the New School and the Henry Cohen Professor of Urban Policy and Management in the New School's Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy. She formerly served as chair of the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board, the CCRB. As you may know, that's the independent oversight for the city's police department. Prior to her roles with the New School and the CCRB, Ms. Wiley served as counsel to the mayor of the city of New York from 2014 to 2016. As Mayor Bill de Blasio's chief legal advisor and a member of his senior cabinet, she was placed at the helm of the mayor's commitment to expanding affordable broadband access across New York City, advancing civil human rights and gender equity, and increasing the effectiveness of the city's support for minority women-owned business enterprises. During her tenure, she also served as the mayor's liaison to his advisory committee on the judiciary. Before her position with the de Blasio administration, Ms. Wiley was the founder and president of the Center for Social Inclusion. She has also worked for the Open Society Foundation in the United States and in South Africa, the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Quite a lineup of important social justice organizations that we rely on now for continuing the work. City and State Magazine named Ms. Wiley one of the 100 most powerful people in New York City in 2014 and in 2015. And once she gets up here, you're going to recognize her as a very frequent face on MSNBC and other social media venues. And she was recently appointed as the legal analyst, I believe, for MSNBC. Ms. Wiley holds a JD from Columbia University School of Law and a BA in psychology from Dartmouth College. And I am just so thrilled that she accepted our invitation to give the Higginbotham lecture this year. It could not be more timely. Ms. Wiley.
Thank you and good evening. All right, so that was embarrassing. It was embarrassing. Every time I hear my way too long bio, it both reminds me of what my children always remind me, which is I'm really pretty damn old. And secondly, that I can't hold down a job. So with those two things in mind, I will still try to be coherent, and it's a real pleasure to be here, both at Penn, but also in Philadelphia, where I actually had my first job after law school, clerking for Judge James T. Giles in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, who revered Judge Higginbotham and had a very close relationship with him. And Judge Giles was always great at sharing all kinds of courtroom war stories, but some of the best were always his stories of Judge Higginbotham as a young lawyer appearing in court, and the way he just broke all the rules because he walked in as a black man, as a judge, and he refused to behave in any way other than a smart, powerful, effective lawyer at a time when that was completely anathema in the United States. And there was something about his power and his ability to do that that had a tremendous impact on my judge, and even just hearing him talk about it had a tremendous impact on me. So I feel like I actually got my start right here in Philadelphia in the judicial system here. So it's a pleasure to be here, and a true honor to be introduced by Professor Roberts, whose work has been so important at the intersection of race, class, and gender, and work that I have followed very closely and found extremely important and valuable. So thank you for your work. So I'm going to apologize in advance because I don't write speeches. I'm really bad at it. And there are two reasons why. One, I can never quite get myself to sit still long enough to write the whole damn thing. But the other reason, and it's even more true I think right now, is even when folks were like, okay, what's the title of your talk? And I was like, race and gender in the time of Trump. And I said that because I was really pissed off that day. And I was pissed off as a black woman. And I said, I'm gonna talk about race and gender in the time of Trump. And I didn't remember why, because that was like 3 weeks ago or however long. And it's now been 5,000 more things that I've been, but I actually also mean that, right? Meaning we're at a time when things are moving so rapidly in the court of public opinion, and in the context of the erosion of what we had come to believe were our national norms, right? This isn't about political party. This is about the notion of like even what our shared sense of values have been as a nation that we thought we had pretty good agreement on. Not 100%, we knew we didn't have 100%, but we thought we had pretty good agreement on it. And we could disagree about how we thought about our democratic values, meaning, sure, we could ascribe slightly different prioritizations of which ones, what does freedom mean and how do we ascribe freedom in the United States can be a very complicated conversation, or what it means to have democracy in the context of elections, and what does it mean to think about representation in government. But generally, this notion of equality and opportunity and freedom and the importance and centrality of our democratic institutions were things we took for granted as fairly agreed, even if we could debate what policies best serve them, even if we could debate, whether or how much we actually lived our values. But we didn't really, I don't think, thought we were at a place where we actually didn't share them. And since November 2016, I think that's shifted for much of the country. Some folks are happy and excited about that shift, and some folks aren't, right? But that it's impossible to understand where and how we've come to the point we've come to as a nation without understanding race and gender in the United States. Impossible. Now, why? Let me ask you a question first. When you came to hear me talk about race and gender in the time of Trump, what did you think you were going to hear? What were your assumptions? Yes, black woman, call and response. Here we go. Me Too, yep, Me Too movement. What else? discrimination. What else? Yes. Focused resistance. Okay, good. You're in the right place. But I also want to. Something happened today at President Trump's post-election press conference, and I thought it was the perfect metaphor for really why I wanted to talk about race and gender tonight. Yamiche Alcindor, many of you may know, she's PBS now, long time, very, very well-established, very well-respected journalist, Black woman. She gets up at the press conference today and she asks President Trump if he's worried that he is sending the wrong message to the country by embracing nationalism. And by that she meant the term, right? He's been explicit. End of October, he's very explicit in saying he is a nationalist. And his response to her, I thought, is exactly and the fact that the two of them were having the exchange, a white man, Donald Trump, and a Black woman, Yamiche Alcindor, he responded by calling her question racist. He called her, and he said it over and over again. He said, that's racism. That's a racist question. And the clear message was also, you are the divider of the country. You are the reason there is not unity, not me, right? Deeply implied and embedded, and he's made it explicit, very explicit at other points in time about the media in general, but also about folks who call into question what it means to be a unified nation in the context of a deeply diverse and diversifying, which is to say, shrinking white population, growing populations of color, right? That, and by the way, where the fastest growing religion in the United States is Islam. And all the diversity that that represents, which is not in and of itself representing any specific ethnicity or racial group. It's actually one of the most diverse religions in the world. So I say all that to say, here you had this exchange. It happened very briefly. It made a lot of news, but it was just as visibly symbolic about the intersections of race and gender in this country, and even how we are being told that we are permitted to talk about it. So let's talk about nationalism, because I had a little taste of this actually back at the end of October, which seems like 100 years ago now. It's actually only November 7th, so it really wasn't. But when this whole nationalism and the word nationalism came up, and I sent out a tweet, because I am addicted to Twitter, and I sent out a tweet about it, and a woman who appears, I don't know for a fact, but appeared to be white, responded to me, "What's wrong with nationalism?" Now, I immediately went to look at her Twitter feed to see who am I, because, you know, could have been a bot from Russia, could have been a crazy right-winger, in which case there's no point in engaging. But I really want to know, because oftentimes I have been very fortunate to get real questions and real engagement. And when I do engage. And her Twitter feed was really interesting, because it was clear that she had a lot of concerns about the direction of the country for reasons I share, right? This was not someone who appeared in a different ideological camp. This was someone who clearly had concerns about Donald Trump and some of the directions of the country in general. So I responded and I said, well, it's because, and I'm paraphrasing, but I basically said, and I pulled and quoted a definition of nationalism, and I said, it's about defining identity and belonging in the country based on race and ethnicity. Based on race and ethnicity, right? By which I mean the default being white. And her response a few minutes later was saying, I looked it up, and the Merriam-Webster dictionary says, no, it's patriotism. I'm a patriot. I'm comfortable with nationalism because I'm a patriot. Now, the truth about, we went back and forth for several rounds, because I was really trying to understand why it also became so important to her because I said patriotism is fine, love of country is fine. I was like, nationalism, it really represents something different, but it's not about an attack on patriotism. And she would not let it go, and neither would I. And finally, we both agreed we would not talk to each other anymore because we weren't getting anywhere, right? The definitional proposition was barring us from being able to have a deeper conversation. And it wasn't actually shedding any light for me. Like, I didn't get a deeper understanding about why it was so important to her to hold on to nationalism, not as a negative. So then I did some research. And here's what I have found. Okay, so one is to say there actually are at least 4 definitions of nationalism recognized in the social science. So it is a complicated term. It does have different meanings. But here in this, I'm citing a study by both Harvard and NYU researchers that was done in 2012, but it was done looking at data from 1996, 2004, and 2012. And it basically identifies, and remember that Donald Trump, when he defined nationalism in his Texas rally and in defending his use of the word nationalism afterward, said, no, it's about country over globe, right? I'm defining it as love of country, which is patriotism. I would call patriotism not nationalism. But that definition of ascribing patriotism essentially was to say, it's not offensive. And implicit is saying I'm not asserting a racial identity to the country, right? Now, if you look at the research, what is so troubling and so complicated about who we are in these 4 different types. One is they're ardent nationalists, right? That's one category. That's roughly 20% of the population as of 2012. Ardent nationalists are folks who express strong national pride, believe the United States to be superior to other countries, and define American identity in ethnically and culturally exclusionary terms. So that category of ardent nationalists kind of falls into my concern definition, right? That's what worries me, that we say we're better than other, because then we're not just better than other countries, we're better than other people from other countries. And remember, I live in New York City, is 38% foreign-born as a population, and it's not just New York City, right? So even what we think of as the origins of the United States, Native Americans as the folks who were here, and the rest of us either got brought in chains or immigrated, right? So that whole us better than is already a concern, even if it's national versus global. It's already imbued with a sense of othering that can become very racialized, very religiously intolerant, very narrowly defined, and very xenophobic. And it also then says something about how we view each other, given that we embody all that complexity in US society. Okay. The second is what they would call American creed nationalism, and that's where nationalists, and that's roughly 23 to 25% of the population as of 2012, and that's people who consider the nation from the perspective of systems and norms, from these notions of tolerance, inclusivity, pride in our democratic institutions. This is what I would call our norms that we thought we had agreement on before November 2016. So that is a positive. So I would say folks who say, well, that's actually what I mean when I think of nationalism. I mean that I have deep, deep, deep abiding pride in a country that values democracy, that values being an inclusive country, that values equality. 25% sounds low. Third group is disengaged. It's disengaged, meaning they see these questions that are getting at their viewpoints on that, and they're kind of the mirror opposite of the ardent nationalists in the sense that they're cynical and critical and disengaged around questions around the country, and have it's a sort of a negative mirror image. And it's problematic for its own set of reasons, right? Because it also suggests a lack of positive engagement in our civic and social life, not just in terms of elections, right? It's much deeper than that. That's roughly a quarter. Now here's the mind blower. The largest group, which is roughly 30% of respondents, and these are the largest groups in 1996, in 2004, and in 2012, meaning this is a pattern that has not actually shifted greatly since 1994. They're called restrictive nationalists. The restrictive nationalists are described as people who agree that what is truly American is Christian, speaking English, and born in the United States. Nativist, right? In a highly racialized way, I would argue. Now, if you combine then the restrictive nationalists and the ardent nationalists as half of respondents, half. Now, this is in 2012 when we're all feeling really good about the fact that we have just reelected our black president to a second term, and whether people voted for him or didn't vote for him is not my point. My point is what it symbolically represented for much of the country went to the American creed, right? Went to our sense of our pride in our democratic norms, in the fact that it held in it a deeply symbolic notion that perhaps our ideals about equal opportunity had meaning. I was actually one of the persons that debated that in 2008 and said that actually isn't what it represented, but the symbolism of it was important, right? The pride in it was important, and I absolutely embraced the importance of that symbolism, while I disagree that structurally that's actually what Barack Obama's election represented. That was my critique, not that symbolically there is something empowering and reinforcing about being one of the few democracies in the world that actually saw a person of color voted to lead a country that was very soon not going to have one dominant racial group numerically. Numerically. I don't mean power-wise, but numerically. Now, if we break down that restrictive nationalist group even further, it gets more terrifying. So not only does it sound terrifying, which it does to me, but there is a surprising lack of pride in American institutions, including democracy, arts, economic institutions, and science. Does that sound familiar? So the attitudes towards immigrants and immigration is pretty clear, but it's even deeper than that in terms of its not embracing even our democratic institutions and the value of things like science, like arts. Now, if you look at who that group is, who do you think population-wise gets represented proportionally in that group of restricted nationalists? The guys. Which guys? White guys. White guys. Older white guys. What about from a class perspective? Poor. Maybe have a high school diploma, but maybe not college, right? Working class. So, yeah, that would be what you would think. 45% of them are strong Democrats. 46% are independents. And that's compared to 38% who are Republicans and 17% who are strong Republicans. And if you look at gender, disproportionately, they do lack a college degree disproportionately, so certainly a working class and lowest mean incomes. So there is certainly those elements in terms of opportunity and what kinds of opportunities they feel they have in the country. They often are evangelical Protestants. and they are more likely to be women than men. And now this study did not disaggregate by race, but what we know from the 2016 election was 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump, despite the Access Hollywood tape, despite him calling all Mexicans rapists, despite him saying that the problem was Muslims and we should ban them from the country in terms of immigration, despite him saying that black people and black community were essentially places where people get shot on every street corner every day by other black people. So despite all of that norm breaking in politics, right, things Mitt Romney would have never said. The closest Mitt Romney came was his 7% statement that he made in a private meeting that wasn't supposed to be public, and was horrified that it was made public. Because the traditional Republican political talking points are social conservative of certainly being a strain, certainly economic conservatism, small government, deregulation, but not directly challenging our norms around fairness, around equality, around civil rights, and around inclusiveness. That creed, that American creed, was one that was considered inviolate, and that wasn't a partisan position. And what Donald Trump did is he actually exploded that tradition, and that, by the way, the roots of that, won't go too much into the history, but the roots of that even predate Barry Goldwater in trying to figure out how you dog whistle and signal racism in a context in which you can't start to say it out loud. And Lee Atwater, who was a political strategist for Bush the Senior, and he actually was not the architect. You all remember the Willie Horton ad? You remember and for those of you who are younger, have you seen in your history classes? Because it's, so, the depiction of a black man who was released on a work furlough and then raped and killed a woman as an attack on the Democratic candidate from Massachusetts, Dukakis. It actually originated with Al Gore's campaign in the primary. It was Al Gore who used the image first. So it was actually Bush picked it up. So when I'm saying all these things, I am not talking partisanship. I'm talking race and gender. And I'm talking about the way that folks have traditionally used it, which is to use the codes and the cues, and that's something that Nixon actually perfected in the Southern strategy, but it started before Nixon, right? Started in the response to the New Deal and in the beginnings of Barry Goldwater. So there's a long history in the 20th century about developing and perfecting this intentionally. And remember that Ronald Reagan announced his presidential campaign where? In 1980. Remember where he announced that he was running for the presidency? Philadelphia, Mississippi. What happened in Philadelphia, Mississippi? Goodman, Cheney, and Swerner were murdered for registering black people to vote. And he launched his campaign there using the terms states' rights, which was something everyone understood, but was his signal to the former Confederacy that he understood race and what side of that fence he was going to stand on. Now, I say all that to say that when you fast forward, so this is what is so amazingly different about November 2016 and the election and campaign that led up to it, is all the Republicans basically backed off of Trump when he violated the rule on racial and gender nicety. Now, this has nothing to do with policy position. This just has to do with what you say and how you say it. But it was viewed as inviolate. Once the Access Hollywood tape came out, that's really when Republicans publicly withdrew their support of him, because they thought, oh, white women ain't going for this. You just talk about grabbing body parts and sexual assault. That crosses a line. that will be extremely bad, particularly for educated white women. This is bad. We're backing up. Now, here's the thing. Remember what I said about those restrictive nationalists? Disproportionately white. Women is my guess. I don't actually have the data points. But we know if we look at the electorate and we look at who voted in 2016 and how they voted, it was that gender gap was driven by women of color. That doesn't mean that a lot of white women didn't vote against Trump. It just means that if you actually look at it demographically, these are the indicators, not gender politics. In fact, it gets even worse, right? It gets even worse. Because even after 2016, so by the way, the way that Trump is able to break the norms on inclusivity, on tolerance, on equality, is by economic populism, right? Is by actually doing the other things that Republicans don't do. Is he starts to complain about NAFTA and TPP and what essentially is the history of free trade policy, right? Which has hurt, in particular, manufacturing families, families who achieved middle-class status because of manufacturing jobs. And it's the combination of those two things and one other thing, right? So those two things very powerful in terms of his ability to, and we saw him doing it now in the midterms and resurrecting it in the midterms, despite the Republican Party saying, please don't do that. Please don't do that again. But what's the other thing? I'll give you a hint. Stacey Abrams. What do you think of if I say Stacey Abrams? Georgia governor's race. Voter suppression. Voter suppression. So the recognition that the way to win is to ensure that Black people in particular in a state like Georgia, which is roughly 36% Black, and by the way, with a reverse migration to the South, and following Doug Jones being the first Democrat to win the Alabama, statewide election in Alabama and be sent to Senate because of Black women. Because of Black women, because of the active engagement and organizing Black women. And the reason that this is so important is because Black women, whether or not they are evangelical Protestants. See, the distinguishing factor is, and we saw this in Brett Kavanaugh, this was for me the final nail in the creed coffin, right? It was Brett Kavanaugh. Because when now for a couple of different important reasons, right? So the last bastion of democratic institution, when the executive branch starts violating democratic norms, which this White House has. Once again, I'm not talking partisanship, because I can think of lots of Republicans who have or could be president who would not have violated these norms. This White House has fundamentally violated norms, including the president saying, the job of the highest law enforcement in the land is to protect me, not the nation. Most of them want protection, by the way. They just know better than to say it publicly. And they'd certainly know better than to cross the line and say it directly to their attorney general. Publicly. Former today. Didn't even get 24 hours, man, since not a big surprise, but shocking nonetheless from a norms standpoint. And by the way, an attorney general who absolutely delivered on every policy platform that was central to Trump's campaign. Caging babies at the border, pulling them from separating families, threatening voters with prosecution, protecting police officers in the context of misconduct, undermining the ability of the Department of Justice to even track, identify, and seek consent decrees for systemic violations of constitutional rights of residents by police officers. This, and then criminal justice reform, right? Sentencing, saying throw the book at them. reversing 8 years of trying to make more fair and rational how federal prosecutors decide how to charge folks who are disproportionately Black, Latino, and Native American in states where Native American population is very large. Now, I say all this because the Brett Kavanaugh, this is what was so astounding to me, and this is why I go back to that restrictive nationalist. Because even I still hadn't learned, right? 2016, my 17-year-old had figured this out, right? The day after the election, she said, "Mom, America's not a safe space." I was like, okay, that's true, but I'm not quite ready to say, like, we're all the way there. I mean, it just happened, there are all these things. But Brett Kavanaugh happens, and it's two things that should have been inviolate, right? Two. The first is lying. I mean, typically, lying is a bad look for a judge. Not so much this time, and a process that actually said we will ignore and bury 97% of the documents that would enable the public to evaluate whether or not he would in fact be truthful, fair, and impartial. Again, fundamental pillars of our judiciary and why it is critical as a check and balance in our democracy, as a democratic institution. But the other one is the one we really know, right? When Dr. Ford came forward, when we first heard that there was someone and the person didn't want to come forward, lots of things you could say about that, right? Lots of reasons to wonder whether or not or how or how significant was it, or would there be sufficient evidence to, I mean, people do lie, people come out and say stuff, and it could have been. Some people are mentally ill, right? I mean, it is important to have a process that is due. But once she came forward, and so the debate around that was understandable, I would argue. I would argue it was understandable, not always fair all the time, but certainly understandable, and not unimportant. And when she came forward, and it was clear that this was a white woman with a PhD in psychology, who was unassuming, who was soft-spoken, who was respectful, who was scared, who was timid, who was everything anathema to the image of the feminist, the white feminist, the feminist, that would be the undoing, because the last norm was that, of course, you couldn't have a credible allegation of sexual assault and sit on the highest bench of the land. And that there was no question about the credibility. And the fact that you had sitting senators, without having heard her testimony, saying they did not believe her was astounding. Not, I'm waiting to hear, I need to assess her credibility. Orrin Hatch said he didn't believe her before she ever uttered a public word. Said she was mistaken. Had never met with her, had never spoken with her. That normally, so let's back up into this whole conversation about our creed. Now, one of the ways that race and gender historically, and actually I was going to reference in the matter of color as well, and exactly what Professor Roberts referenced. Fundamentally, the way we have built the disunity of our country historically has been how we have developed our conceptions about race. And so fundamental to that is the formation of the country itself that we still live with, both in our popular imagination and our understandings of race and gender. And what I mean by that is something that was in Judge Higginbotham's book. It was also in a very important book by a historian called Timothy Allen called The Invention of the White Race. And the reason it's an important book is it's this notion that it is a construct. It had to be invented. And in order to invent blackness, because blackness didn't exist at the very beginning of the Virginia colony, paganism versus Christianity existed. And the distinctions between white European indentured servants and black slaves in the early part of the Virginia colony and pre the full development of what we have come to know as chattel slavery was this notion that if you could dehumanize someone who wasn't Christian, but it wasn't their Africanness, it wasn't their blackness, it was their paganism. And in fact, black folks and indentured servants intermarried, they were not segregated, they lived together. And so the construction of chattel slavery and the pulling apart of what was developing as a close-knit community of indentured servants and black chattels, what were becoming black chattel slaves, required saying that the legal status of the child would run with the woman, which created property interests in women, right? So if you were a man, you had a better property interest and your children had a better future, you could be with a white woman. And if you were a black woman, it meant your children would now be born. Their birthright would be slavery, notwithstanding who the father was. Even if the father was a white man who was no longer indentured. And that also became, and then our conceptions around the need to protect white women, right? So there's a lot of history here, and I'm not going to go into all of it, but when you fast forward to that Kavanaugh hearing, one of the things that, and certainly as black women who are disproportionately subject to sexual violence, not white, I mean, sexual violence is a problem in this country for everyone, including men and boys. It's a huge problem. About literally the projections are 1 in 3 women are subject to some form of sexual violence. That includes rape, but it also includes sexual assault that isn't completed into rape and sexual molestation. So it's a big number. Men is 1 in 6, and that's probably a deep undercount. When you look at it by race, the rates jump up substantially for women of color. And the likelihood of their victimization by law enforcement if they complain also increases. But so when Dr. Ford came forward, because there was a lot of comparisons made to Anita Hill. And the comparison we didn't make was, except it was a black woman and a black man. So societally, the stakes, in addition to the fact that we hadn't quite as a nation come to the Me Too moment, but even the Me Too moment ignored sexual violence by and large against women of color, even in the past 2 years. And women of color, I don't know if you remember the Time magazine color on Me Too. So Me Too was first coined by a black woman working on issues of sexual violence for girls, and it was a way for black girls to try to take back some power in recognizing they were not alone and having been victimized by sexual violence. And, to the credit of an Alyssa Milano, who was the one who really popularized it in this Me Too moment, and not intentionally, but unfortunately made it much more linked to Hollywood. That was not her intent, by the way, but certainly made it much more about Hollywood. But when that Time magazine colored, the Time had pulled together women who had been kind of leaders in the movement, including Ms. Burke, from the Girls for Gender Equity, who coined it. And in the photograph, she got cut out. She actually got physically cut out of the photograph. That would not have ever happened to a white woman. I'm sorry. It wouldn't have. We can debate it till the cows come home, and you will not move me off this position, but she wouldn't have gotten cut out of that image if she were white. Now, so when you fast forward to Kavanaugh and to this, so when Dr. Ford came forward, me and there are a whole bunch of us legal analysts at MSNBC who happen to be women. And we were like, this is done. This is done. We were up there going, oh yeah, this ain't going over societally. This is not and remember that, except they were making all the wrong noises, But then Jeff Flake, thanks to activism, and by the way, one of those activists, a brown woman, right, Ana Maria Aquila, who's an organizer, who cornered him and literally, but with all of the truth of her experience, all of the rawness, all of the power of being able to and willing to make herself vulnerable to Senator Flake, and shaming him enough that he knew he had to come back and make a deal for a full process, not even a full, but to say, reopen it for a week, because the FBI thought they could do it in a week, right? Reopen it in a week. We can't just sweep this one under the rug. So interesting, but we had already violated the norm at that point because of the willingness to ignore a white woman who did not threaten. Think about that. This was not Gloria Steinem. No, because that would have been different politically, right? I mean, it would have been much easier to take cover if it had been an aggressive white woman, if it had been a white woman who was outspoken, if she had been angry, right? The way it would play on TV would be off-putting, unfortunately, to a lot of white women. And that's the truth. But because she didn't do that, because that's not who she was, I think she was very true to who she was, but because she was not that, it was already a violation of the norm. But then we thought the other norm, the FBI, the independent law enforcer, and me and others, we started tweeting once we heard that the White House violated the other Democratic norm, which was to then try to limit the scope of the investigation so that all these witnesses that were coming forward saying, oh yeah, by the way, he drank all the time and he was grabbing girls and he was, right? That would have to come forward, that they were gonna have to vote with all of that in the public eye, except that the White House then says, yeah, you can't do, in fact, don't even talk to her. Don't even talk to Dr. Ford. She already gave her statement. There's nothing more to learn there. And what that meant, so when I saw that, I was like, we're done. That's the last nail in the coffin, because the Senate, with all, and the debate and the notion from, because I just want to read some of what came out and the debate around it after. It's painful for me to still read. But you literally had people saying that Judge Kavanaugh, was totally destroyed. Totally destroyed. Destroyed. Man got a job, but he's dead somehow. He's totally destroyed. Not her. What she went through, the death threats, the fact that she had to leave her home, separate from her kids, that she had to be public when she did not want to be, when she had tried to move on, but there was no destruction to her life. And then viewers started saying, I'm not just talking about the pundit class on Fox News, but viewers started saying, if it can happen to him, it can happen to my son. Can happen to my son. So in a context of a nation where 1 in 3 women and at least 1 in 6 men are subject to sexual violence, the narrative becomes, we have to protect people from accusation. We have to protect men and boys from accusation. Not from a lack of due process, from the mere accusation of sexual violence. And that what that really meant, when you start to look at it by race, is that women of color are driven even deeper into this abyss of a system that is saying that they will not be protected, because Dr. Ford wasn't. There is no message to women of color that is that the system will work for you if you come forward, which is already suspect because of a whole losing rape kits and a whole lot of other things. But once that happened to Dr. Ford, it was a public message not to come forward with claims of sexual violence to anyone, about anyone. And then think about the other racialized component of this, which is the notion that due process and innocent until proven guilty now applies to white men rising to positions of power. People of color, in the context of policing, immigrants at the border seeking asylum, which is a lawful process, folks contesting around their rights in the criminal justice system, that's not where we're talking about innocent until proven guilty. That is not where we're talking about whether or not our systems, our democratic institutions, our creed is being protected. We are only talking about it in a narrow band of the highest halls of power occupied almost exclusively by white men. And that message has been sent in a very public, emotional way. Now that but before I end and open up to questions, but I don't want to leave you where I've left you, right? I know, I'm depressed too now. But there's the but, which is we are at a time when I would argue where we've been before. Because despite that notion of the American creed, for most of the history of the country, it has not been reality. It's been our belief, but it's not been our reality, right? We can talk about Reconstruction, post-Civil War, we can talk about the Jim Crow South, we can talk about the Trail of Tears, we can talk about the fact that white men had to go to jail who did not have land had to go to jail for the suffrage. They had to protest and go to jail for suffrage. White women took 100 years. And only before they were abused in prison in violent ways did the kind of mood of the country start to turn. But we have a long history of all of these things that we have held dear, not actually being reality. It's really only since the mid-20th century that we were trying to make them a reality. And we made not all the strides we needed to, but we did make some important ones. And in the context of the important strides we've made, we are now experiencing a retrenchment. But the signs that our creed is not dead, that despite those numbers about the restrictive nationalists and the ardent nationalists, there's still the other 50%. And in that other 50%, and I'd argue it's more than that, right? That's a 2012 number. And we have seen in the midterms, right? 59% of women supporting the candidate that I would argue whose primary message was more about unity, was more about investment in our people, was more about pre-existing conditions and more about jobs and more about justice. That was a substantial increase that has meaning for us. And we can't ignore that but for active, aggressive attacks in 36 states on the ability of citizens to vote, that we would have seen different results. And we have to remember that. And we have to celebrate the fact that we had 24 ballot initiatives, 24 states with ballot initiatives that were about criminal justice reform. They were about 3 red states expanded Medicaid in a ballot initiative. 3 red states. We saw felony disenfranchisement removed from Florida, 1.5 million people, 1 out of 13 are Black. And 5 years of Stacey Abrams fighting to register 800,000 people to vote does not go away overnight. And that all of those and I don't actually even like the word resistance. I actually like the way Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow, says, we're not the resistance, they are. We actually are the American creed. We are the American people, all of us, who stand by the fundamental aspirations, not always reality, but aspirations of that creed. And the outpouring that I heard, even from purple, I had women identifying themselves as purple to me, saying, I don't want this. This is not who we are. And our fundamental call back to the aspiration of our creed matters. We can't keep trashing that it's not our reality. We do have to call that out and be honest about it and seek the solutions to it. That's not about capitulation on it, but a recognition that we are in a time and place in this country where the most important thing we do is say we're an us. And that is inviolate. And that the rule of law is inviolate. And that our democratic institutions, we will not tolerate them being violated. And that there's much we will have to work out from there, including the fact that as a rapidly changing country, which we are, with significant problems from climate change to incredible wealth divides, to the fact that most families in this country cannot afford college, that those are what is undermining our ability to be an us, not anyone that people try to get us to other. And that, I think, really is the strength of our country. I think it is embedded sufficiently in a large enough number of us that we have to call the better angels of those folks who are so scared, who feel so terrified that we have to save them from themselves. And that's not a popular message. And when I give that message, most people say, but let me say why I mean that. I don't mean all of them. And I ain't talking about the Proud Boys, okay? I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis. I am not talking about the white nationalists, although I do think there are programs that are effective at helping to prevent people and help them escape. So I do think that matters. But what I mean is that there are a number of folks in this 50% that are us. And we should not ignore that. Thank you. So I think we have time for questions or comments. I don't know. We do comments.
My name is Deshaun Hendricks. First off, thank you for coming and giving this talk. This is the exact intellectual discourse that made me want to come back to school. I'm a first year graduate student at the Wharton School.
Oh, great.
And my question is around, given that the community I'm in at the Wharton School is not one that the law school, the College of Arts and Sciences, that environment warrants this type of intellectual discussion. Your story in the beginning surfaced when you were talking about your conversation with the woman on Twitter. Mm-hmm. You made sure to read her Twitter timeline before you had that discourse. I don't have the opportunity to read that timeline before I have discourse with anybody, right? So what is your strategies? What are these strategies to understand what conversations to have with certain people and identify the people that you can really make that progress towards?
That's a really important question because I think it's something we all have to get better at. And there are times when I don't have that luxury either. So one is we have lost the ability to listen. And I mean that because some of that's social media, some of that's the speed with which dialogue happens, some of that is because we are in a much more segregated spaces than we have been in, right? Segregation has grown in all its forms in the past 3 decades. And this is what I was trying to do with this woman on Twitter, is like, ask questions. So I'll give you an example. I was on Joanne Reed's show, and this was during Kavanaugh hearings, and Joy had a white woman, young, who's a Republican. Did you watch that show? That was special. But it was stunning because she was screaming at us, and she was a survivor of rape. She was a rape survivor. She was a young woman, right? She was in her, I don't know, maybe late 20s. So it was a horrible conversation on television. I mean, she was just yelling, and Joy was constantly saying, "That's just not true. I can't let that stand because that's just not factually accurate." I mean, it was terrible as a dialogue. Afterward, and we were all so shaken because we were trying to figure out, like, here's a woman who has been a survivor at the same time that she's saying some pretty reprehensible things about women. So you're trying to figure out how to have the compassion at the same time, because her line was, if you didn't go to the police, Dr. Ford, then you don't deserve to raise a claim or have any attention given to your claim. That's, in other words, put the onus on the victim, right? And which completely misunderstands everything about what is going on psychologically and in terms of trauma. But so I think the point was, and she had a friend of hers there was a man who was also very conservative. And we had a hallway conversation after the show. Well, I just asked questions. It's like, which starts with compassion, right? So first of all, that's awful and it shouldn't happen to you, right? I think you have to always connect to the human, and it shouldn't happen to her. And that kind of compassion is not what we're getting from the other side, and we have to live that compassion, because we have to model how we need the behavior to be back in response to us. But the second was to say, tell me why you feel that way. And I asked her, I said, tell me why you feel that way. And then she started talking about what happened to her, and that she went to the police immediately. It happened to be a family member. She went to the police immediately. And I said, right, what do you think enabled you to go to the police immediately? And, she started saying, well, because the police protect you. I said, so the police don't protect me. The police, I have lots of friends who don't feel protected by the police. So it's not so easy. Or, in the case of Dr. Ford, she was someplace she wasn't supposed to be, right? Then you get worried about, they're all so we started unpacking it, and I said, the question isn't what you did, the question is, how do we understand what motivates people who have different experiences? And by the end of the conversation, I did not move her one iota. Her white male conservative friend said, I trust you. And that for me was like, that's the goal. It's not agreement in the first instance, it's trust, because that means we can continue to talk. That means you might be open to actually hearing and understanding an experience that's different from your own. And I think it is critical that we, in very painful situations, try to figure out how to ask questions and listen, then engage from a place of compassion, and that finds what we're hearing in a way to make a connection to why our experiences are different. And there is actually communications in social science about why that works. And the other way to do it, which is called frame breaking, because her frame was a criminal, like if you're not complaining, it's because you're lying, right? That was really her. There's a strict father criminal justice frame in communications theory that goes along with that. If you take that to its logical conclusion, right, which is what I did, I said, so all those kids in the Catholic Church raped by priests are liars. And she was like, I didn't say that. I said, no, but that's the implication of what you said. That's actually the societal implication. I'm not saying that's your position, but think it through, right? That is actually so that's a frame break, right? Where you take it to its crazy conclusion, extreme conclusion. Both those things can be very effective, and I think the important thing about you being at Wharton is that it is exactly those kinds of spaces where we have to be asking those questions and creating those connections and having a much more instructive dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us, your time, your heart, your research and everything. My name is Wes, and I was listening to the news a little bit today, and my question is about if you can speak to the political scene a little bit, because it just seems like Trump with the tweets and like the conference today is so relentless. And there's like a sense that, well, we don't want to lower ourselves to his level. We want to be the better people. And I sort of caught that sense watching the PBS NewsHour last night. Nancy Pelosi was talking about, well, we don't want to use the word impeachment. And so there's like all these folks on this side trying to be not necessarily tame, but be the better person. But on the other side, there's none of that. There's Trump being relentless. I mean, it's just like overwhelming. And he has full support of the Congress who normally would support those norms.
Yeah.
So that it's really great to hear you talk about those interpersonal interactions and how you can gain trust and listen. And I know I'm well suited to do that with people in my own racial group and my own family. But is there anything you can speak to about like the political discourse level? Because that conversation you had happen off the screen, but on screen we're all sort of like gasping for air.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I certainly didn't mean to say it's only interpersonal. I just do think the interpersonal is critical, and particularly when we are privileged to be in these spaces where we can talk across those boundaries. So I think we have to own the privilege of that and do that as much as we can. But absolutely, the public discourse matters too. And I think, put aside Nancy Pelosi, I think part of what we have to separate ourselves from in terms of the public discourse is the Beltway discourse. The thing that was so powerful about the midterms was, one, the incredible amount of engagement by people who traditionally don't even engage in midterms. It's been true since 2016 that 19% of folks participating in demonstrations and protests never did before. So we do have all these indicators of engagement. Where it is more effective, though, in my view, right? I mean, unless you can try to do what I do, which is at least, have a privilege of trying to talk to people across the country by TV, is state and local. It's state and local discourse. So the ballot initiatives that we saw, and some of them were regressive and bad. I mean, it wasn't all, but this is my point about 3 Republican states on ballot initiatives voting for the expansion of Medicaid, right? That's what shows you the Beltway discourse is not actually matching up to the opportunity even in red states. It's not speaking to the needs of people. So I think the question becomes, where are the political discourse opportunities in public? I don't mean that, I mean that in a small p, not partisan or purely electoral, but the policy discourse, what are our problems and how do we solve them together? There's a huge amount of opportunity for that at state and local level, and it's actually critical that we build that up. It's critical that we build that up. Like, so if you look at Georgia and Florida right now, despite Stacey Abrams pushing for the runoff or Andrew Gillum having lost, there is a whole, that's not about what's going to happen in the next election cycle. It's about what happened with those ballot initiatives. Was amazing. And that's what we have to, and so it's finding the levers where we make change with a policy win, whether it's a ballot initiative or legislation, and drive the public discourse on that, but in a way that talks about it as our shared needs. And there's some issues that are harder to do that. I mean, I'd say immigration has become the great wedge. Criminal justice, ironically, not as much of a wedge as it used to be, because there's because even libertarians and folks who are anti-big government want to see that part of government shrink. So even some of the issues that typically would be highly racialized and we wouldn't be able to make common cause, there is actually more opportunity now at state and local level. At state and local. So think about state and local is kind of my message when it comes to the public discourse.
Hi, my name is Paula Mans. I teach at a community college, economics, and I'm really exhausted because I'll start the class and I try to find out at the beginning of the class, just so I don't shoot myself, who's liberal and who's conservative at the beginning of class. And one of the things that, I really try to do is create an environment of safety where people can share their ideas and their experiences, but I stress the importance of going back to the facts. So that's kind of what I do.
That's refreshing.
And I force everybody, let's go back to look at the economic data.
Yep.
Because the data will speak for itself. But it's still exhausting when you hear, as that young man said, people with these very strange views. I had this one student that was taking an intro econ course, and he was calling people idiots, and he he didn't even know what he was talking about, but just the language is so cruel. But I'll give you an example of, I have a very good friend who's white. So I'm exhausted trying to teach in this very divided community that we have now. But even a very good friend, when the issue with the Starbucks happened with the young black men, I'm sorry. So it was exhausting. How do I survive? I spent an hour talking to her about why some young black men can't sit in Starbucks. And why shouldn't they be arrested? And this is a very good friend that marched with me, in the Me Too movement. How do I take care of myself? Because it's exhausting.
So look, it is exhausting times. It is exhausting times. Look, I think we're all exhausted. And self-care is critical, and picking our battles is critical. I'm really not suggesting you try to talk to everybody. I'm really not. And sometimes you have, and I've said it to people, I was like, gotta go. I mean, I just can't do it right now. Like, thank you, bye-bye. And because you do have to create some boundaries for yourself. I mean, we all have to create some boundaries for ourselves. And I think the question becomes, where is it? Frankly, it was energizing for me in the context of that hallway conversation I was talking about, because it was driving me crazy that I couldn't, when you're on TV and you're having this conversation in a box, right? Knowing that and seeing that people are having these conversations all over the place, but I'm in the bubble, right? It was incredibly energizing and important to me to try to break through, right? And even though I didn't break through to her, it actually was energizing to me that we still didn't agree, but he was listening. That was empowering to me. So sometimes you're like, okay, this might be good for me. And sometimes you're like, this is just gonna be exhausting and it's not a good use of my time. So give yourself permission not to engage. Definitely give yourself permission not to engage. I ignore some stuff and I make decisions about like my point about, I wasn't gonna engage with the woman on Twitter if it was just gonna be a fight. That's not a good use of my time or hers. So I like to think about it from the perspective of both what brings energy to me, or learning, something that brings something to me, or where, if I expend the energy, do I think I'm going to have an impact, right? So sometimes it's like really picking, like in the context of the public discourse, what issues? You're like, don't do everything. Don't. Figure out the issue where, like, I think one of the smartest things, I had some friends saying, I'm just gonna put all my money in the felony reenfranchisement flight in Florida. And I was like, that's what I'm gonna pay attention to. Pick a battle. But the reason that was smart is it was a battle about power and inclusion, right? So I mean, I would say, but be strategic about it. Pick because it can make a difference in terms of whether we are actually getting to reestablish the creed that is fundamentally about a democratic, inclusive America. So that would be my advice.
We have time for just one more brief question from the other side. Okay, well, this side.
Good evening, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
I'll make a brief comment and then a question.
Okay.
The comment is, I think that there were a lot of white, educated women that may have had buyer's remorse for what they did, voted for, or what they didn't do, did not vote in 2016. Because a lot of white educated women, us too, sat beside men in class, sometimes helped them, a lot of times were smarter than, and saw them get the grades. We all graduated, and then you see them get the opportunities that maybe some who are white, educated women didn't get, and the same for women. So that's a comment. Here's my question. I saw with such energy the young people. I have a 17-year-old daughter.
Me too.
Her generation, they're going to do it. And when I saw them organize from February forward, not just speeches, but rallies and things like that, and I said to myself and to anybody I knew, we either need to support them or get the hell out of their way. Question, what should we be doing for the future? What should we be doing to support them, encourage them, because they really are going to do it.
Well,
And they're now starting to vote.
yes, the voter turnout was incredibly important for 30 and unders, historic levels for not just, I mean, there was lots of historic voting in the past midterms, something to feel good about. And I absolutely agree with the importance of the engagement, but by the way, both of white women in suburbs, to your point about buyer's remorse, potentially, but also I think we saw a lot of participation increase radically across a bunch of different categories, which is good as well. Here's the thing, and my kids actually have said this back to me is, don't put this all on us, you messed it up. Like, so it's there, but I mean, I think there is something truthful in that, right? It's, we want to support this generation's leadership, and that's critically important. And we can't abdicate our responsibility either just because they're stepping up. And in fact, so one of the, because I teach, right? I mean, I think a lot about, and I teach a lot around, how do I help embed the structural analysis that helps our young folks figure out the strategic interventions that change the structures, right? So this would be the point about, yeah, you know, dream defenders in Florida, brilliant to say, oh, we're gonna make this felony reenfranchisement because that's about power. And that's about inclusion, and that's about us having a voice. That's about folks, doesn't mean you know how people are gonna vote. It's just wrong. And it's disproportionately us. And that was young folk led, right? So how do we have more people able to make those kinds of strategic intervention decisions and also be able to do it, because I am struck by the young leaders that I know that are particularly impactful are compassionate. And they actually know how to have a debate. And not everyone does. I mean, to the point about, like, I've got students who just start yelling at people. I agree with them politically, but I'm like, stop, what are you doing? That's not effective, and I don't even want to listen to you. And I agree with you. That's a problem for you. So there is some both support of their leadership capacity, but it's also recognizing we have to also be in it as well. The only way, because of that 50% number, and let me give you one thing that's the other reason why this is so important for us to be engaged, because, and this is global research as well as US research, millennials are significantly more likely to not value democracy. And that is, again, not a partisan position. We are seeing a trend, and it's about 24%, so it's not everybody. But that's a large number of millennials to be saying, oh yeah, maybe a military coup is okay. Like, I find that astonishingly scary, that there would be anybody of that generation who would say, military coup, yeah, Maybe that could work to improve the country at some point. I won't take that off the table. No, that should not be on the table. So I do think we have to recognize that it is not a monolithic generation, and we shouldn't treat it as such, and we shouldn't abdicate our own responsibility to the future.
Thank you.